Philadelphia businessman Fred Hagen discovered that Papua New Guinea was more brutal than he dreamed possible. It took more than guts to tackle this terrain. Fred Hagen spent 4 years and $250,000 trying to solve the mystery of why his great-uncle crashed in the jungles of New Guinea. One of the best pilots in the Second World War, his uncle pioneered a technique known as skip bombing and was featured in Time magazine as Bomber Benn. Hagen was determined that Major William Benn took his proper place in history.
I became interested in going to New Guinea because I wanted to search for the wreckage of the plane in which my great-uncle, Major Bill Benn, was killed on January 18th, 1943.
Fred Hagen never intended to be an explorer. He owns a prominent building firm in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, 10,000 miles from these rugged peaks. He arrived in 1995, haunted by his family history and a great-uncle he'd never met. Somewhere in the exotic landscape of New Guinea, an island just north of Australia, lay the answer to his quest.
It's like another world here.
In 1957, 14 years after Bill Benn's plane went down, an Australian search team apparently found his B-25 bomber and recovered the crew's remains. Their report put the wreck 2.5 miles northeast of the summit of Mount Strong. But no one had seen the plane since. The report was all Hagen had to go on. In New Guinea, there's little of the brick construction that Hagen knows so well, and the going was slow and difficult. To save time and to lessen their burden, the guides hacked out campsites en route.
So Mount Strong's here. We came...
Hagen's search first focused on the western face of Mount Strong, where the report said the B-25 was found.
So you're saying...
His guides knew of many crash sites on these slopes, but Hagen only wanted to find one. He hoped that finding his uncle's plane would help him tell the true story of Major Bill Benn.
When they're hunting, they find it plane crashed.
This is long time ago.
Yeah, long time ago.
40 years.
40 years.
As I learned more and more of the story, I became convinced that there was an historic injustice done. There are numerous books that refer to Bill, but they refer to him more as a footnote. And I wanted to tell his story because he was such a pivotal part of the early war in the Pacific, but he was basically eclipsed by subsequent events. General Kenny said no one in the Pacific theater had made a greater contribution to victory than Bill Benn.
Lieutenant General George Kenny, commander of the Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific, directly credited Benn with revolutionizing the use of aerial warfare. 5 months after bombing Pearl Harbor, the Japanese war machine roared through the Philippines and set its sights on Australia. But to get there, they had to conquer New Guinea.
New Guinea's a theater that has been largely forgotten. Most Americans that I've talked to are actually surprised to find out that we fought bloody battles and pivotal battles in New Guinea as a launching pad to go up to the Philippines. They know that MacArthur returned to the Philippines, but they don't know how he got there.
Heavy losses at Pearl Harbor left the United States with a patchwork of aircraft, planes that weren't hitting the mark.
Some of those early missions were rough. They sent us into Rabaul one night after shipping. We got across the target and everybody down there that had a gun was shooting at us. We've trying to hit ships from altitude, and if the ship was moving, they were extremely hard to hit. And we did a lot of missing.
And I was the bombardier, and I missed it every time. The ship was simply too elusive to hit. We would drop the bombs, and the bombs would tail off to one side of the ship or the other.
All a Jap has to have is either good eyes or a pair of binoculars. And he says he just watches you come over, and when you drop your bombs, he says full starboard or full port. And every picture we had, you could see that's what was happening.
The air war was in a tailspin. General Kenny needed a new strategy, so he turned to someone who could get the job done. His aggressive young protege and a charismatic leader, Bill Benn.
Bill Benn was the most vital, exuberant person. He just had a way of attracting people's interest and attention. And he certainly had mine.
Ben had heard about a technique the British were trying called skip bombing, but it meant changing the way pilots flew.
Bill Benn's skip bombing attack involved taking a B-17, later a B-25, putting it into a dive, achieving a high level of speed, leveling out at low altitude.
Fly right at the ship, release 2 bombs. The bombs would be flat when they hit the water, and they'd skip across the water like you'd skip a rock. The object was to hit the side of the ship and start to sink and go off. It'd sink while you was looking at it.
Before coming to New Guinea, Hagen had spent months researching Benn's history and was eager to find his uncle's lost aircraft.
When I went to New Guinea, I had absolutely no clue what I was doing. I had no idea what I was getting into. I had no idea how to go about doing it. I was just simply like a blind man surging forward without a compass.
I'm actually looking for, the one I'm looking for is up on top of the mountain. If it's going to take a bit of cutting.
And I went to New Guinea, and I made contacts in 1995. I took helicopter flights up into the jungle. I tried to land at villages near the target area.
Is there anything else he remembers from the...
I asked a lot of questions, and the principal thing I got out of that first year was an education. I realized for the first time the nature of the challenge that I had accepted, and it was not something that I understood prior to going. I had absolutely no clue what I was getting into.
To help navigate, Hagen relied on his helicopter pilot, who'd had years of experience working with the highland people of New Guinea.
My
pilot, Brian Lamplow, is a Kiwi by background, which is a New Zealander.
Okay, but everything must be shared.
And he's quite a character.
Okay, if we take 4 men, we crash, dive, finish, okay? Yeah, you'll be out straight. Be straight. No beating around the bush. All right? Okay?
He was as good in the air as he was with the locals.
He would do things that were risky and very aggressive, but he would do them in a very competent way, and I always felt very comfortable with him.
Already weary of the jungle, Hagen took a break from the search for Benn's B-25 and headed underwater to explore another plane his uncle flew, a legendary bomber known as Blackjack.
It was magnificent, sinking down through 100 feet, 120, 130, and then all of a sudden just seeing the shape of this massive B-17 bomber materializing deep underwater. And the Blackjack was part of the squadron of B-17s that Major Bill Benn commanded. And this was a plane that my great-uncle had actually flown. It was completely intact. In fact, the machine guns are still sitting, and you can still rotate them on their axes. I don't know if it was the effect of nitrogen narcosis at that depth or just the excitement or probably a combination of both, but I know that when I entered the fuselage of that plane that I just felt a wave of euphoria just sweep through my body.
But this was only a diversion. Hagen returned to Mount Strong and the site of the 1957 find. On this day, after 3 rough hours in the turbulent mountain air, he spied a glint of metal on the horizon. Could this be the plane he'd traveled halfway around the world to find? Fred Hagen was a man on a mission to ensure that his great-uncle, Major William Benn, received his proper place in history. He hoped that by finding his plane, he would find answers. While scouting the hills of New Guinea, Hagen had spied a silvery shape in the distance. But as they descended, he could see it was a B-17, not the B-25 Benn had died in. Still, the downed bomber held a powerful attraction for Hagen, who's also an accomplished pilot.
Rear flap off this wing, this rear aileron. You can see where it broke off here.
Benn transformed the art of aerial bombing with planes like this one. Each wreck has a story to tell.
Strings of bullet holes here, the round holes about 6 inches apart. Clearly a Zero was closing in and firing bursts.
The bullet holes and broken parts spoke to Hagen of lost battles and the desperate struggle for survival.
Again, you can
the aeroplane's propellers offered clues about the last moments.
Which indicates that this engine was spinning at full tilt when they hit the ground. Each one is bent, if only one would be bent if the engine was not running when they hit the ground.
It was easy for Hagen to imagine the young men who flew these aluminium ghosts. Hagen had searched for miles around the location provided in the 1957 report with no luck. He faced a crucial decision.
I was disturbed that I had not found anything that I was originally looking for. I hadn't found Bill Benn's site. In fact, I'd come to understand that I might well never find it.
Hagen decided to return home, uncertain about his quest. But a year later he was back, returning for another 6-week expedition. Fred wasted no time returning to the mountains in search of help. This time he headed deeper into the jungle, to some of the most remote cultures on Earth, the highland people of New Guinea. For this community, the mountains are a way of life. They know its secret paths and how to avoid its treacheries. Fred needed that knowledge. But the Highlanders had had little contact with outsiders. They were hospitable, but also cautious and suspicious. Even as he shared a meal before setting out, Fred felt on uncertain ground. The coming days proved he had reason for concern.
Yes.
Yeah, this is Papua New Guinea. I can see that it's Papua New Guinea.
Here, all we've had is problems. Okay?
As I'm saying.
No stolen gear. All right? We're getting to the stage where this stolen gear hasn't all turned up yet.
I see that.
We've got a man that cannot sleep on the mountain because of the stolen gear.
But it wasn't just missing equipment. A local stimulant along with cutting tools and weapons proved a frightening mix.
The natives chew the betel nut, kind of a narcotic, and they are all equipped with razor-sharp machetes, so that the combination of the drugs and having a handy weapon all the time is a matter of concern.
After trekking through the rugged jungle for 3 long weeks, Hagen was exhausted. The expedition fell into a relentless routine of marching and camping. They lived almost entirely on rice and beans.
We can have a fresh meat tonight.
The natives attempted to supplement those rations by hunting a small animal called a cuscus. It's a small marsupial. And they would butcher them at the campsite, throw them in the fire, and basically just pull them apart and eat it. I didn't eat much at all. I mean, even the rice and bully beef was a bit much for me. So I lost 20 to 30 pounds. The jungle in New Guinea just absolutely wrung me out.
In 1942, after weeks of trial runs, Benn was convinced that skip bombing would work, but his men weren't buying it.
We thought it was a silly idea. It was rather a crazy idea, and he had to sell us on the idea.
I was pretty apprehensive about what would happen or could happen.
It was a voluntary effort. He would not order us out to do the job. We talked it over, and Tupacine and I said, we will do it. The others were doubtful.
I didn't see how anybody was going to live through it, and I had a great desire to live through it.
One of the top pilots in the squadron, a legendary flyer named Ken McCullough, had been a boxer in his college days. It was a skill that turned out to be useful in recruiting volunteers.
So he went in, and about 5 minutes later, I don't know whose nose was more bloody or whose mouth was more bloody or anything else. Mac was ready to fight anybody in the world to make sure that this mission was carried out, this first skip bombing mission.
Those first missions were flown in B-17s. Later, Major Benn would turn to the smaller, more agile B-25, the plane Ben died in. Its unusual twin tail helped Brian show the villagers what they were looking for.
Tail like that, or tail... One
yeah, like this.
Like that one.
Yeah.
Like that one.
So it's maybe a 17 then.
Yeah.
The further into it I got, the more intensely wrapped up in it I was, and the more passionate I was about finding it. And I know a lot of people question my sanity, quite literally asked me if maybe there was something wrong with me or was I crazy, and maybe I am. I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that I couldn't let it go without finishing what I had begun.
Hagen found wreck after wreck northeast of Mount Strong, but not Benn's downed bomber. It was a grim exercise that led to a painful conclusion. The 1957 report was wrong. He had nothing to go on. The plane could have been anywhere. Mount Strong began to look like a giant haystack.
The low point came. We only had a few days left. I knew I was running out of time, and as we were struggling back to our camp, I was just absolutely wrung out, just at the limit of my physical abilities. I remember breaking out of the jungle, and when I came out on this field, I thought all I had to do was walk a few hundred yards across the grass, and I would be there. Unseen, in the middle of the field was another crevasse that dropped down. And I remember going down and having trouble just physically going up the other sheer slope. It was wet, it was muddy, it was almost vertical. And I was just so exhausted that I hardly made it up, and just completely done in.
Hagen was emotionally exhausted as well. He considered calling off the expedition.
Today was pretty brutal. Lots of up and down. Across creeks, through jungle so thick you couldn't see 10 foot on either side of you. It was probably as difficult a terrain as you can imagine. So, we're all tired, not just me. We didn't find our B-25 today, so we'll move forward tomorrow. We'll search that area, and then we're running out of time, so we're going to have to reevaluate if we don't find it tomorrow. Not giving up yet, but we'll reevaluate, maybe take a different strategy.
Bill Benn's skip bombing exercises seemed to go well, but the pilots remained fearful. This was a new and dangerous tactic, and to make it worse, they planned to attack at night. They would have to fly just 60 feet above the water, in darkness. There was no room for error.
Our best shot would be to catch a moonlight night so you could pick up a ship in the moon slick, we call it.
Would make the bomb run from the dark side. They could hear us but not see us.
The first skip bombing attack was in 1942 in Rabaul Harbor. Bill Benn led the forces in the battle.
The first mission was so successful, they sunk 100,000 tons of shipping that night. And it just took the Japs by so surprise that they had no defense in the world for it. I could feel the bombs go off, we were so close. Got both of them on the same run and made the circle and came back and looked, and they were both gone when we got back, so we'd sunk them that quick. The Japs got on to one little trick. They would turn a machine gun up on the ship and fire straight up and make you fly through it. We got a hole one night that way, a 30 caliber hole. And that was the only hit they ever got on us in skip bombing.
That October, Benn and his crews sank Japanese cargo ships, destroyers and cruisers without losing a man or plane. General Douglas MacArthur personally awarded Bill Benn the Distinguished Service Cross for gallantry. In a cover story in Time magazine, Benn was credited for his heroics. Sadly, on the day the issue appeared, Benn and his crew vanished in the jungles of New Guinea.
I was not stricken with horror. I just felt, as General Kennedy did, he's going to show up. You just could not imagine Bill Benn's being wiped out because he was so resourceful. He was so resourceful. I kept hoping that maybe he'd been stranded on some island and would be found.
With 1 week remaining before he had to head home, Fred added manpower. He sent out multiple teams of trackers and ferried them supplies. With just 3 days left, one team attracted his attention with smoke signals.
We could see the smoke in the distance. We could also see that they had begun to cut a clearing. There was no reason to cut a clearing, just for us to drop food off. And as we flew over, we could see in the very corner of the clearing the shape of metal.
Hagen prayed that this was it.
It was very, very exciting to know that there was an aircraft here.
But the team hadn't cut a large enough clearing for the chopper to land safely.
We flew back later in the day, and at that point they had taken the time to enlarge the clearing and had actually constructed a small helipad out of saplings and vines.
Brian attempted to land, weaving between the branches with only inches to spare. The landing pad looked treacherous. Brian was not sure if it would support the helicopter. He hovered just long enough for Fred to jump out and then flew off. Just ahead, Fred saw where the guides had propped up their prize.
This is the canopy of the aircraft, which the boys took off the
Once
top.
again, it was the wrong plane, but it proved different.
I was able to quickly determine that it was a P-47 Thunderbolt due to the fact it was a single-engine plane with a four-bladed propeller hub. That could only be a United States P-47.
He's pointing, there's some bullets from the machine guns inside the structure of the wing. And
the P-47 was a heavily armed fighter plane. One of its missions was to escort bombers like Bill Benn's.
We've got the tail number of the plane. This is the rudder, this is the tail of the aircraft. Number's 28059. These numbers are incredibly well preserved.
Then Hagen and his team found something else, something he hadn't found in the other planes.
We have found some evidence of vertebra and remains, so we are now fairly certain that this pilot crashed with his aircraft and was killed.
I was becoming frustrated by the fact that I was having so much trouble finding Bill Benn's plane. But it was liberating to realize that I had spent all this money and made all this effort and spent all this time, and I had done something. And I had done something very, very special.
This was right behind the pilot's seat to protect him from getting shot from the rear.
The plane captured Hagen's imagination. Fred wondered who had sat in this seat and flew this crumpled relic. Brian returned to pick up the team, worried about predictions of a treacherous change in the weather.
Do you see the helipad, and is it big enough? You're right on top of us. Circle around.
But Fred was so caught up in his find that he wanted to spend the night on the mountain.
We need more time. Why don't you just leave us here tonight?
You're not going to get more time, Fred, or you're going to die. Let's get me out of there.
Determined to get them out, Brian risked skimming through overhanging jungle onto the flimsy landing pad. Fred gave in, hoping the fighter plane's tail numbers would provide answers. Instead, they opened the door to a whole new mystery.
Still showed it as missing in granite.
Fred Hagen had unexpectedly stumbled over human remains in the wreckage of a downed Second World War fighter plane.
Couldn't get back till the next day, and they dug up, you know, quite a bit of the airplane, and they dug up the cockpit area and had this thing all strewn about. So that was his serial number. DESI.
After dozens of phone calls, Hagen discovered the lost pilot's name, Wilfred Desilets. He had been listed as missing in action since 1942. Who was Wilfred Desilets, and who did he leave behind? Hagen began with Wilfred Desilets' last known address, Worcester, Massachusetts.
It was very difficult because I came to learn later that Wilfred was the only son in a family of 7 sisters. They had all become married. There was no one in his immediate family that still had the Desilets name.
Finally, he got lucky. And it wasn't just any day.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Is this Yvette?
Yes, it is.
Yes, Yvette. My name is Alfred Hagen. I recently discovered a P-47 Thunderbolt. I believe to be the plane that your brother was flying when he was killed.
It was such a shock when Yvette called and said that someone had found his plane. This is my sister Will.
Fred arranged a reunion in Desilets' hometown, where he introduced himself to the family.
Thank you so much.
And this is Andrews. He was crashed on the same flight as Bill.
He's the one?
Yeah. It was one of the most wonderful experiences I've ever had of just meeting this family and finding that they still love this brother and missed him.
Excuse me, but who's that little kid?
Young Bill Desilets was the star in a family of 7 doting sisters.
That's what is so wonderful. He was so special to us. The day after Pearl Harbor, he went down and enlisted. But he was always so upbeat that you thought, oh, it can't happen. You just never thought it would.
It was the wartime telegram every family dreaded.
We were going in the door, and there was this paper on the doorknob. You know, my father saw it. His face dropped a mile.
It was devastating to see his face. I'd never seen my dad cry in his life or in my life. And he said, no, he's not dead. He said, he's just missing. My mother was so sure he was coming back.
The sisters never stopped dreaming that their brother would return.
We often wondered and hoped that he had crashed and lost his memory and would be coming back to us.
We never stopped wondering what happened. We really have closure now.
Inspired by his experience with the Desolates family, Fred decided to go back to New Guinea for a third try.
Year 3 was an absolute nightmare. I was actually told not to come by Brian because of the conditions in the country, so I went anyway. And Brian, of course, was correct in his assumptions. But we went out and attempted to go to Mount Strong. And the entire mountainside around Mount Strong, there was an entire mountain that was on fire. Not exactly the area I wanted to search, but the smoke was so dense through most of the interior of the country that you literally could not fly. There were villages that had become dependent on flights coming in, and they were actually starving because you could not fly in the Central Highlands. The smoke was that dense.
Even when Fred found ways of getting up into the mountains, the villagers capitalized on his difficulties, demanding higher wages.
Now, 50 kina, 50, 50, 50. M-Tesso? M-Tesso?
Fred offered a bounty for any dog tags of US pilots, hoping they might lead him to Bill Benn's bomber. Unfortunately, Papua New Guinea is an island with more than 750 indigenous languages, and no word for dog tag. To Fred's dismay, the local people expected to be paid handsomely for every piece of scrap metal with English letters on them.
What's wrong, Fred? The dog tags are not... Do you know where another plane is?
Hagen received information and leads, but nothing seemed to bring him any closer to finding Bill Benn's plane. It had been his worst trip. Hagen went home empty-handed. But that winter, the unexpected happened.
Some natives were out searching, actually found a dog tag, and they returned it to a French priest in a little village called Camelai, and he sent me a letter. And the letter said, if you're looking for a plane with names such as these, and the name listed on the dog tag was Laverne Van Dyke, and Laverne Van Dyke was the flight engineer on Bill Benn's flight.
The letter provided Hagen with the strongest clue he'd seen in 3 long years. At last, the missing B-25 had been found.
Sunrise, July the 5th, 1943, H-hour for Operation Citadel. 900,000 Germans, 1.3 million Russians. 8 days later, 1 million men killed, wounded, or missing.
Fred Hagen returned to New Guinea for a 4th trip. But this time he had real evidence that Major Benn's B-25 had been found, a dog tag from a crew member.
Where you found the remains, the skull, you can take me there? You remember where you found the tag? Okay, I need to go there.
A local villager named Joseph found the tag and the debris from a warplane, but he was not sure if it was a B-25.
Yeah, we can...
Well, we've come to Omu village and met with Joseph and Ludwig, who have found the remains. And we're ferrying the men and equipment up now, preparing to go up ourselves on the next trip. And we'll go down and clear the site out and investigate it as best as possible.
On the steep slope of the mountain, a few silvery bits of torn metal revealed the site of a plane wreck. It was located on the opposite side of Mount Strong from where the search team said it was in 1957. Fred strained to see if it was a B-25, but to find out for certain, he had to land and trek by foot. After hours of struggling, they came upon the first signs.
Yeah, here it is. I see the wreckage down there.
That's one way to do it.
The plane's star and wing markings remained remarkably well preserved.
This is the rear aileron, the tail, and the tail rudder on one side. There would have been two of these.
The wreckage was definitely a twin-tailed B-25, but was it Bill Benn's?
There should be a tail number for lucky. Looks like a 1, a 2, and there's more numbers here, but they may be worn off.
This is the cockpit panel of the B-25 with the radio call sign clearly evident. You can see it right here, 112485, which is clearly the wreck of Major Benn's B-25.
Fred had finally found what he'd been searching for, the plane Benn flew, known by the crew as Algernon 4.
Beautiful.
Then one final bit of confirmation.
We just found that it's Don C. Young. He was the major that was on board the flight.
The dog tag was a poignant reminder of the men who had perished with Bill Benn.
Right in. Joseph has just found pieces of bone in this aluminum covered by dirt.
I had gone through so much and come so far, traveled the world several times over. I had finally found what I had begun looking for. And although I never personally knew Bill Benn, I had learned so much about him that I felt I knew him as well as anyone at that point. And it was a very emotional moment, but in a quiet way.
But the original question remained. What had brought down this great warbird and its unshakable pilot? Hagen tried to put the pieces together.
And here we have one of the props, which is virtually undamaged.
Unfortunately, he had lost his left engine, and we were able to determine that because when he hit the ground, the propeller blades that were on the top of the engine were not
still has
bent
the original
back.
yellow paint on the end even.
So Benn had been flying on one engine, a nearly impossible task in these mountains.
He was trying to return over the Owen Stanley Range in basically torrential and vicious thunderstorms. And now that was weather that Bill was well equipped to handle. He was a very, very competent and calm flyer in the worst of weather.
But Benn had two things against him, bad weather and a bad engine.
As a pilot, I can well imagine what Bill's last moments were like. He was flying a crippled airplane, was fighting for his life, was trying hard to get back to base to protect the lives of his men. Then he found this river valley that he hoped would offer him a route to salvation, and he was flying up it. It began closing in around him oppressively. He was in violent thunderstorms. They had very heavy weather that day. When you have a crippled airplane on one engine, you're working very hard to keep it in the air, to get as much altitude as you can, and it's not very responsive when you have to turn.
Because of the mist, Benn didn't realize he was flying into a boxed canyon.
And when he came around that last curve in the valley, as the cliffs were closing in on each side of him, and he realized he could go no further forward and he could not get the power to go over the top, I can just imagine him straining with every nerve in his body to turn that aircraft. He needed to turn at 180 degrees, and he got about 90 or 95 degrees before he went into the side of the hill.
Fred took back parts of the plane, hoping to recondition them and display them in honor of Bill Benn's memory. The fuselage and wing were left behind as a silent memorial. At last, Fred had solved the mystery of his uncle's death. Thanks to Hagen, the Desolates family too could lay their brother to rest. His parents had their son's name inscribed on their own tombstone.
They wanted to be a memorial to Wilfred. His father went to his grave not knowing the fate of his son, his mother also.
At least the sisters knew the fate of their lost brother.
The mystery was never really settled until now.
You know, where is Bill? At least now we know.
I didn't embark on this quest to find missing aircraft. I was looking for Bill Benn, and it had never even occurred to me that I would find missing aircraft. It was something that I had not expected, gratitude that I felt that I didn't even deserve.
Senator Bob Smith of New Hampshire honored the debt owed to families like the Desolates.
Mrs. Sheriff, it's my honor to present to you this flag on behalf of a grateful nation for the service, patriotism, and heroism of your brother.
When we find a single aircraft missing in the jungle, when we find the remains of a single pilot, when we go back and find that there are people still grieving for him after the passage of over half a century, we can understand the sacrifices of that generation.
What had started as a search to find a single plane turned into an emotional journey and gave Hagen a new respect for his uncle's generation.
I wanted to honor what we come to know as the greatest generation of Americans, and Bill Benn certainly was one of their foremost members. And I wanted my efforts to be worthy of them and worthy of what he did. It cost me time and it cost me effort. It cost Bill his life, and his investment was so much more than mine.
After 4 journeys halfway round the world, Fred Hagen felt he finally knew the true story of one of America's heroes.